This is what REST API documentation looks like. Notice the typical try-pane format with options to try out the REST API calls using the documentation UI. This sample uses Redocly as the interface tool. And this is what API documentation looks like. API docs typically just include information about the class, method, input parameters, and the output received. And unlike REST API docs are specific to a programming language. Here it is Python. But how does API documentation come into being from scratch? Let's do this step by step, starting with this small sample Python program that controls an elevator. In this code, move is a method that takes a single parameter, floor, which is the floor to which the elevator needs to move. This is what we need to cover in the API docs, so that someone could read and reuse the code. Here's another version of the program with the description of the elevator class and the move method added at appropriate places as comments. This is the restructured text, or RST format of documentation, which is similar to the Markdown format, extracted from the Python comments. Using a tool called Sphinx, we can generate HTML output from the RST files, which looks like this. So, to recap, we embedded comments in the Python code, then generated a restructured text file from the comments, and then used Sphinx to generate HTML output from the RST files that we can host as API documentation. And now, about REST API documentation starting from the same Python code. To document a REST API, we first need a REST API, which we create from this code by importing the Flask framework and embedding the REST constructs in the code to make it a REST API. All this, of course, will be done by the developers and not the technical writer. If you look at the code, to make a REST API out of the code, URL path is defined. The added JSONIFE method will return data in a JSON format. Further, we add comments describing the methods and parameters with hash prefix at appropriate places in the REST API code. Then we can extract a YAML file from the code and view it in the Swagger editor. Now we have the structure of our REST API documentation. Typically, this is where a technical writer comes in to edit the YAML spec to make the information better and compliant with the standards. Finally, the REST API reference documentation is hosted and presented using a tool such as Redocly. Of course, there are a few more steps such as authentication that are covered in the process, but overall, this is the flow of how a piece of code becomes a REST API, and the REST API docs are created for it. Further, a partner developer will read this documentation to create code to interact with the elevator class and pay the owner of the move class to use the code. To recap, we created a REST API from the Python code using the Flask framework. We then embedded comments in the code and generated a YAML file. We edited the YAML file in the Swagger editor and then hosted it using Redocly for consumption by partner developers. This, however, is the dreaded code-first approach that most established companies take to REST API development. In an ideal world, it is done differently. REST APIs are designed first and then coded. More on this in the next video, entitled Code First versus API First. Here's a comparison table of API docs versus REST API docs. But the main thing to remember is that REST API and REST API docs are not specific to a programming language, as they deal with the REST layer of endpoints, methods, error codes that interact with the underlying code, as we saw earlier. This is what makes REST popular and pervasive, thereby increasing demand of those who can build REST and document REST.